everybody, it's Courtney and I'm here with another video for Trinity Stamps. Today we're going to be creating some faux dimension with some shadowing for a one-layer card. I'm starting here with a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock. This is cut down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and I have a piece of masking paper here that's cut down to 3 3/4 by 5, and I'm just centering that in the middle of my card panel there the best I can. I'm going to be using Rusty Hinge and Wild Honey Distress inks just to add some color to the border of my card panel. I'm starting off with the Rusty Hinge and I'm just pretty much going over the masking paper itself just so the edges are darker than the rest. Once that was down, I moved on to the Wild Honey and pretty much just covered up the rest of the area. I didn't really get that much contrast here. These colors are pretty similar, but we're going to be adding a shadow with our Copic markers later. Now you can use distress oxides here, but I find that when you use your Copics or any alcohol markers over the oxides, they tend to get a little bit muddy. So I prefer to use the regular distress inks for this, but they still remain wet. The paper will remain wet regardless of what ink you use. So when you do remove your mask, you just want to be very careful so that it doesn't tear your paper as you're peeling that up. Once I had that middle mask removed, I'll move on to some Post-it note tape here, and I'm just going to be masking out one corner at a time with the Post-it note tape, and you don't have to do the whole thing. It's just basically the corner where we're going to be stamping. I'm going to be stamping the larger image within the Let Love Grow stamp set with Blackout Ink by Ink on 3. This is a Copic Safe ink, and I'm just going to be stamping that right in the corner, right over that Post-it note tape. Next, I'll mask out the bottom corner or the diagonal corner from this one with that same masking or that same Post-it note tape and stamping my image again. Now you can certainly use a stamp positioner for this. I kind of wish I would have because it really wasn't even with the other one, but that's okay. Sometimes it's best not to be perfect. Next, I'll remove my Post-it note tape and we'll move on to the coloring. I won't show you all of the coloring here. I'll just show you one of these, but I wanted to stick to mainly blues and blue greens. So I'm starting with this largest succulent right here in the center. I'm starting with my B91, which is my lightest color, and I'm just mapping out my darkest areas, which will be in the center or where on the bottom of each of the petals where they meet in the middle, and also creating a shadow where one petal is laying behind another. Once all of my darkest areas were mapped out, I moved on to my darkest color, which is the B99, and I'm just adding my very darkest areas here. I'm not adding a whole lot of this. I'm mainly just concentrating on the shadowing where one petal is laying behind another. Sometimes I'm doing a few little flicks on the larger petals, but some of the time, or most of the time rather, I'm just doing a very faint line just with the tip of my marker barely touching the paper. Once I had my darkest color down, we'll move on to our darkest mid-tone, which is the B97, and we're just going to extend those areas out a little bit. I'll start my flicking here on the petals that I haven't already started my flicking, thickening up some of those lines that are the shadows for the petals that are laying behind another one. Now for the middle petals, they're kind of folded over, so I didn't really worry about the parts that were folded over. You can certainly create a shadow for that area as well, but I just pretty much covered that area, not really concerned with the ones that were laying over on itself. Next, we'll move on to the lightest mid-tone, which this is the B95. I know that the cap is off screen there a little bit, but I'm pretty much just doing the same thing, extending those lines out and extending those flicks out almost to the tip of each of the petal, just leaving enough room for my highlight color. Some of the petals that are right directly next to each other, I left a highlight on either side of the petal as well, just to kind of differentiate between the two petals. Finally, I'll go in with my lightest color. This is the B91. and extend all of those flicks all the way out to the edges of the petal as well as either side. For our next succulent, I'm going to move on to some BG markers, and I'm only going to be using 3 colors on this image. Again, I'm going to start off with my lightest color, which is the BG72. And I'm going to just start out, like always, mapping out my darkest areas. For this particular succulent, it's pretty much going to be where the another petal is laying over that one, the one that you're coloring, I guess. So this one is pretty, it's not as open as the first one, so there's going to be a lot more shadowing and less highlight on this one. For my darkest color, it's the BG78. Again, I'm just putting a line here. There's no flicking at all here. Just putting a line in the darkest areas. Then I'll extend those lines out, make those a little bit thicker with my BG75, just leaving the tips of each of the petals for my highlight color, going back to my BG72 and filling the rest of that in. Next, I wanted to, like I said, stay with blues. So we're going to move back to some B markers. Now these are kind of hanging off the edges, so it's kind of hard to see what the image actually is. So I'm not really too concerned with the shadowing here. So I'm going to start off with my B14, and this I thought was going to be my lightest color, and just mapping out those darkest areas. Again, you can barely see what this is, so you don't really have to be too concerned about the shading as long as there's some dimension. Next, I'll move on to my B18, cover up those areas that we had mapped out with the lightest color, then move on to my B16, and then realize the B14 was just a little bit too similar to the B16, and I wasn't getting really any contrast at all. So I took out my B12, and that will be my lightest color for that one up in the corner. Next, for the little gems, I guess they are, we're going to be moving on to some YR markers and Y markers. So again, starting off with my lightest color, which is the Y08, and just mapping out my darkest areas. Now, in order to make these look shiny, I guess, I'm not doing any flicking at all. I'm just doing a straight line where these are kind of sticking out, I guess, the shape of them. Next, moving on to my YR68, which is my darkest color, using just the tip of my marker to add a little bit of shading. Next, for the Y38, just extending those lines out a little bit and also creating a shadow where one is laying over or under the other. Y35 is the lightest midtone, and then I'll move back into the Y08. And I colored the other image the same exact way. Now you'll notice that when I did my stamping, I didn't really pay attention to this gap where there's pretty much nothing there. So I wanted to fill that in, and I just filled this in solid. So I'm starting with my BG15 and just mapping out where my darkest areas will be. Moving on to the BG18 and just pretty much going over that same area. Going back to my BG15 and extending that out. And I decided I wanted a little bit more contrast, so I ended up bringing in my BG11 and filling in the rest of that area. Now, in order to create some fake dimension here, we're going to be adding a shadow. So I'm going to start off with my C5, and this is the darkest color that I'm going to be using. And here I'm just trying to figure out which direction I want my card panel to be. And I'm just going to be creating a shadow underneath this particular image, and it's just going to be on the bottom of that one. Now for this next one, I'm just going to pretty much create a shadow off to the left to make sure that the light source is consistent with that first one that we created a shadow with. Next, we'll move on to the C3 and just extend that shadow out a little bit further. And finally moving to our C1 and extending that even further. Now I also wanted to create a shadow for my fake panel here. So I didn't trust myself to be able to draw a straight line. So I took out my T-square ruler, and again, starting with my C5, and I'm just doing a straight line right along where that distress ink meets the rest of the panel on just 2 of the sides. Again, keeping that light source consistent. And next I'll go in with my C3 and just extend that line a little bit further. I did skip my C1 here just because that would have completely been lost within the distress ink. Once I had my shadows down, I'll go ahead and stamp my sentiment. I am arranging this sentiment on my card panel, then decided to take out my MISTI just to make sure that I was able to stamp this the way I wanted it. And I'm going to be stamping my sentiment with VersaFine Onyx Black ink. Once my sentiment was all stamped out, I did want to add just a little bit of shimmer to the gems there. So I took a sparkle pen or a shimmer pen by Nuvo and just added sparkle to those. And also wanted to add a few sequins. Even though this is a 1-layer card, I needed to add some sort of embellishment here. So I arranged some of my sequins from Trinity stamps around my sentiment, a few scattered here and there, and glued those down with Ranger Multi-Matte Medium. And that is the card for today, guys. Thank you so much for stopping by, and have a great day. Bye.